You are a Spanish court physician in the royal palace of Madrid, and the year is 1700. Your hands shake as you approach the bed where the most powerful man in Europe lies writhing in agony. King Charles II of Spain, ruler of an empire that spans 4 continents, cannot perform the most basic human functions. His jaw protrudes so grotesquely that he cannot chew solid food. His tongue is so swollen that his speech is unintelligible. Drool constantly streams from his mouth because he cannot close it properly. His legs are so weak and deformed that he didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. But this isn't the worst part. As you examine the 29-year-old king, you realize that his body is failing in ways that defy medical understanding. His head is misshapen, too large for his frail neck to support. His spine curves unnaturally, forcing him into a hunched posture that makes breathing laborious. Seizures rack his body multiple times each day, leaving him unconscious and frothing at the mouth. Most tragically of all, this man who commands the loyalty of millions will never father an heir because his reproductive organs are as malformed as the rest of his body. What you're witnessing isn't the result of disease or accident. It's the culmination of 2 centuries of deliberate genetic destruction, the final horrifying outcome of a royal family's obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. Charles II carries the genetic burden of 16 generations of Habsburg cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and siblings producing children who would inherit thrones across Europe. His family tree doesn't branch. It's a twisted loop that strangles itself, and Charles is its dying victim. The man who should be the pinnacle of royal perfection is instead a living testament to what happens when human beings are treated as breeding stock rather than individuals deserving of dignity and choice. This is the story of how one family's pursuit of genetic purity created the most inbred human being in recorded history. A man so damaged by his ancestors' choices that his very existence would bring down the greatest empire the world had ever known. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. To understand the horror of Charles II's existence, we must first understand how the Habsburg family transformed from successful medieval nobles into the architects of their own genetic apocalypse. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't stumble into inbreeding by accident. They pursued it with the calculating precision of scientists conducting an experiment, except their laboratory was the human genome, and their test subjects were their own children. The nightmare began in the early 1500s when the Habsburg family achieved something unprecedented in European history. They became too powerful for their own good. Through strategic marriages, military conquest, and political maneuvering, they controlled vast territories, spanning from Austria to Spain to the Netherlands. Their empire was so enormous that they famously declared the sun never set on Habsburg lands. But this success created a problem that would ultimately destroy them. The Habsburgs became convinced that their remarkable achievements were the result of superior bloodlines, divine genetics that set them apart from ordinary mortals. They began to see intermarriage with other royal families, not as an opportunity for alliance building, but as a contamination of their sacred blood. The family developed an ideology that bordered on religious fanaticism about genetic purity. They believed that marrying outside their immediate family would dilute the special qualities that made them fit to rule. This wasn't just political strategy. It was a fundamental belief system that viewed their DNA as literally blessed by God. By the time of Charles II's birth in 1665, this obsession had reached its logical and horrifying conclusion. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides were also closely related. When geneticists finally analyzed his family tree in the 21st century, they discovered that Charles II was more inbred than the offspring of a brother and sister would typically be. The Spanish court by 1665 had become a palace of genetic horrors, where deformed children were celebrated as signs of royal purity rather than warnings of systematic destruction. The most powerful empire on earth was being ruled by a man whose own body was evidence of his family's catastrophic choices. Charles II's entrance into the world on November 6, 1665, was met not with joy but with horror that court officials struggled to conceal. The future king of Spain emerged already bearing the unmistakable signs of genetic catastrophe that would define every moment of his tortured existence. His head was grotesquely oversized, his jaw protruded at an unnatural angle, and his tiny body showed clear signs of developmental abnormalities. The royal physicians found themselves confronting medical challenges they had never encountered. The infant's skull was malformed in ways that suggested severe brain development issues. His breathing was labored from birth, indicating respiratory problems that would never improve. Most disturbing of all, his reproductive organs showed signs of the same developmental failures that affected the rest of his body. As Charles grew from infant to child, the full extent of his genetic damage became increasingly apparent. He didn't speak his first coherent words until he was 4 years old, and even then his speech was barely comprehensible due to his malformed jaw and swollen tongue. Court records describe a child who would drool constantly, creating puddles on the marble floors that servants had to clean throughout the day. Walking proved even more challenging. Charles's legs were so weak and deformed that he couldn't support his own body weight until he was 8 years old. Even then, his gait was unsteady and painful, requiring constant assistance from court attendants who had to catch him when he fell multiple times each day. His spine curved unnaturally, creating a hunched posture that caused chronic pain no medical treatment could relieve. The seizures began in early childhood and only grew worse with time. These weren't mild episodes that could be discreetly managed. They were violent convulsions that would strike without warning, leaving the young prince unconscious and surrounded by frightened courtiers. During these attacks, Charles would foam at the mouth, his eyes would roll back, and his body would shake so violently that witnesses feared he might die on the spot. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was Charles's mental state. Despite his severe physical disabilities, he retained enough cognitive function to understand that he was different. Court observers noted that he would sometimes stare at paintings of his ancestors, seemingly trying to understand why he looked so different from the strong, healthy kings who had ruled before him. The daily routine of caring for Charles required an army of servants and medical professionals. He needed help with the most basic functions: eating, drinking, walking, even sitting upright for extended periods. His food had to be pureed because his jaw couldn't handle solid substances. Multiple servants were assigned to clean up after him throughout the day, as he frequently lost control of bodily functions during seizures. The psychological impact on the Spanish court was devastating. Nobles who had dreamed of advancement through royal favor found themselves instead serving as caregivers to a monarch who required constant medical supervision. The grand ceremonies of Spanish court life had to be modified to accommodate a king who might collapse without warning, or require immediate medical attention during important diplomatic meetings. Foreign visitors to the Spanish court wrote home in shocked amazement about what they witnessed. These were hardened diplomats and military officers who had seen battlefield casualties and survived plagues, yet they were unprepared for the sight of the most powerful monarch in Europe, struggling to perform basic human functions while trying to maintain the dignity expected of his position. The creation of Charles II wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a systematic approach to human breeding that the Habsburg family had pursued with scientific precision for over 2 centuries, turning their palace into a laboratory of genetic horror. The creation of Charles II wasn't an accident or the result of ignorance about genetics. It was the inevitable outcome of a systematic approach to human breeding that the Habsburg family had pursued with scientific precision for over 2 centuries. To understand how an entire dynasty could knowingly create such suffering, we must examine the institutional structures that made this genetic nightmare not only possible but celebrated. The Habsburg approach to marriage was fundamentally different from that of other European royal families. While most dynasties used strategic marriages to build alliances, the Habsburgs had convinced themselves that their bloodline was so superior that mixing it with others would actually weaken their power. They developed elaborate genealogical theories that portrayed inbreeding not as a dangerous practice, but as a sacred duty to preserve divine genetics. This ideology was supported by court physicians who had been trained to view Habsburg deformities not as medical problems, but as signs of royal authenticity. When Habsburg children were born with a characteristic protruding jaw or other family traits, court doctors celebrated these features as proof of legitimate bloodline rather than warning signs of genetic damage. The Catholic Church played a crucial enabling role in this systematic destruction. While canon law technically prohibited marriages between close relatives, the Church routinely granted dispensations for Habsburg unions that would have been forbidden for ordinary people. These dispensations weren't issued reluctantly. They were celebrated as recognition of the special status of Habsburg blood. The economic incentives for continued inbreeding were enormous. Each Habsburg marriage kept vast territories and wealth within the family rather than transferring it to potential rivals. The Spanish crown controlled silver mines in the Americas, trade routes across multiple continents, and military forces that dwarfed those of other European powers. Perhaps most perniciously, the system created its own momentum through the sunk cost fallacy. After generations of inbreeding had produced increasingly damaged offspring, the Habsburg family couldn't acknowledge the problem without admitting that their fundamental ideology was wrong. Instead, they doubled down on their beliefs, interpreting each new generation of genetic disasters as evidence that they needed to be even more careful about preserving bloodline purity. The international community's response reveals how easily systematic abuse can be normalized when it serves political interests. Other European powers, who should have been horrified by Habsburg practices, instead found them useful for their own purposes. A weakened Spanish monarchy meant reduced Habsburg influence, which benefited rival nations. The most tragic aspect of this systematic approach was how it created a feedback loop of suffering. Each generation of damaged Habsburg children provided justification for even more extreme measures to preserve bloodline purity. The worse the genetic problems became, the more convinced the family grew that they needed to avoid contamination from outside bloodlines. To truly understand the human cost of Habsburg inbreeding, we must look beyond Charles II to the other victims of this genetic experiment. Each generation produced children whose suffering served as stepping stones toward the ultimate catastrophe of Charles's birth. Let's begin with Charles's aunt, Maria Theresa of Spain, born in 1638 as the daughter of Philip IV and his first wife, Elizabeth of France. Even this relatively distant marriage between first cousins produced devastating results. Maria Theresa exhibited the classic Habsburg deformities from birth: a severely protruding jaw that made eating difficult, a curved spine that caused chronic pain, and developmental delays that left her struggling to master basic skills well into adolescence. What made Maria Theresa's story particularly tragic was her keen intelligence trapped within a severely damaged body. Court records describe a young woman who could speak multiple languages fluently despite her speech impediment, who showed remarkable insight into political matters despite her physical limitations, and who desperately wanted to fulfill her role as a royal daughter despite her obvious unfitness for marriage and childbearing. When Maria Theresa was married to Louis XIV of France in 1659, the union was celebrated as a diplomatic triumph. But the reality was far more horrifying. The French court was shocked by the Spanish princess's appearance and behavior. She drooled constantly during court ceremonies, struggled to walk without assistance, and suffered from seizures that would strike during important diplomatic functions. Louis XIV, initially sympathetic to his young wife's condition, gradually grew disgusted by her physical problems and began conducting affairs with healthier women who could provide him with the normal marital relationship that Maria Theresa's condition made impossible. She spent her final years in isolation, knowing that she had failed in her primary duty as a royal wife. Even more tragic was the story of Charles's older sister, Margaret Theresa, born in 1651, when Habsburg inbreeding had reached even more extreme levels. Margaret Theresa's condition was so severe that court physicians debated whether she could survive to adulthood, let alone fulfill the marriage obligations expected of a Spanish infanta. Her developmental problems were apparent from infancy. She couldn't hold her head up properly until she was over 2 years old, didn't speak coherently until she was 5, and showed signs of intellectual disability that made it difficult for her to understand even simple concepts. Her physical appearance was so disturbing that foreign ambassadors who met her as a child wrote home in shocked amazement about the genetic damage visible in the Spanish royal family. Despite these obvious problems, Margaret Theresa was still considered valuable as a political asset. She was promised in marriage to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, when she was just a toddler. The marriage, which took place when Margaret Theresa was 15, was a disaster from the beginning. Her wedding night required the presence of physicians because her physical condition made normal, intimate relations dangerous. Margaret Theresa died at age 21, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of her Habsburg inheritance. Her death was mourned throughout the empire, but not for the right reasons. Courtiers and diplomats lamented the loss of potential heirs rather than the tragedy of a young woman whose life had been sacrificed to preserve a bloodline that was already poisoned beyond redemption. When Charles II finally died on November 1st, 1700, after 35 years of constant suffering, his death triggered the largest European war of the 18th century. The War of Spanish Succession, which lasted 13 years and killed over 1 million people, was the direct consequence of the Habsburg family's genetic experiment. Their obsession with bloodline purity had created a king so damaged that he couldn't produce an heir, leaving the vast Spanish Empire without a clear successor. The immediate aftermath revealed the full extent of damage that centuries of inbreeding had inflicted not just on the Habsburg family, but on the Spanish Empire itself. Charles's inability to rule effectively had allowed corruption to flourish throughout the government, economic mismanagement to bankrupt the treasury, and military decay to weaken Spain's defenses. The empire that had once dominated Europe was reduced to a second-rate power. The international response to Charles's death was telling. Rather than mourning the passing of a fellow monarch, European courts immediately began plotting to divide Spanish territories among themselves. The Habsburg genetic experiment had become such common knowledge that no foreign power believed Spain could continue as a major force under its traditional ruling family. The Spanish people themselves paid the ultimate price for their rulers' genetic obsessions. The War of Spanish Succession devastated the Iberian Peninsula. With battles fought on Spanish soil and Spanish resources drained to fund a conflict that existed only because their king had been too genetically damaged to produce an heir. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree confirms what court physicians had suspected for generations. Charles II was the inevitable outcome of systematic inbreeding. Scientists who studied his genealogy in the 21st century discovered that his level of inbreeding exceeded that typically seen in the offspring of siblings. His genome was so damaged that survival to adulthood represented a biological miracle. The Habsburg response to this catastrophe reveals the institutional blindness that had enabled the genetic experiment in the first place. Rather than acknowledging that their inbreeding practices had caused the crisis, surviving family members blamed external enemies and divine displeasure for their dynasty's collapse, apparently incapable of learning from their own destructive history. The Habsburg genetic experiment isn't just a historical curiosity. It represents patterns of systematic dehumanization that continue to manifest in different forms throughout modern society. Understanding how an entire dynasty could knowingly create such suffering provides crucial insights into the dangers that contemporary institutions face when they prioritize abstract goals over human welfare. The core mechanism that enabled Habsburg inbreeding was the treatment of human beings as means to an end rather than individuals deserving of dignity and choice. This same logic appears in modern contexts, where genetic testing, reproductive technologies, and social policies reduce people to their biological characteristics rather than recognizing their inherent worth as human beings. The Habsburg obsession with genetic purity finds disturbing echoes in contemporary movements that seek to engineer human genetics for perceived improvement. While modern science offers genuine benefits through genetic screening and therapy, the Habsburg example serves as a warning about what happens when genetic ideology overrides humanitarian concerns. Perhaps most relevantly, the Habsburg story demonstrates how institutions can perpetuate systematic harm through willful blindness and self-serving justifications. The same patterns of denial, rationalization, and victim-blaming that characterized Habsburg courts appear regularly in modern scandals involving corporations, governments, and other powerful organizations that prioritize their own interests over human suffering. The international community's complicity in Habsburg practices also provides lessons for understanding how systematic abuse can be normalized when it serves broader political or economic interests. Just as European powers found weak Spanish monarchs useful for their own purposes, modern institutions often tolerate harmful practices when confronting them would threaten established relationships. Most importantly, the Habsburg legacy reminds us that good intentions are not enough to prevent systematic harm. The family genuinely believed they were preserving something sacred through their marriage practices, yet their sincere convictions led to centuries of human suffering. This serves as a warning about the dangers of ideological thinking that places abstract principles above the immediate welfare of real people. Return with me now to that palace chamber where we began, watching the court physician tend to the broken body of Charles II. In that moment of medical horror, we witness more than just the suffering of one man. We see the final chapter of a dynasty that had spent centuries systematically destroying its own children in pursuit of an impossible ideal of genetic perfection. Charles II's twisted spine, malformed jaw, and seizure-racked brain weren't accidents of nature or acts of divine displeasure. They were the inevitable outcome of human choices made by people who convinced themselves that ideology mattered more than individual welfare. His ancestors hadn't stumbled into genetic disaster. They had pursued it with the calculating precision of an experiment. Except their laboratory was the human genome, and their test subjects were their own descendants. The man who should have been the pinnacle of royal achievement instead became a living monument to the dangers of treating human beings as breeding stock rather than individuals deserving of love and dignity. His inability to father children didn't just end a dynasty. It triggered wars that killed millions and collapsed an empire that had dominated the known world. Charles II achieved a kind of immortality, but not the glorious legacy his ancestors had sought. His name survives as a warning about what happens when power becomes disconnected from humanity, when abstract goals override immediate human needs, and when institutions become so invested in their own ideology that they cannot see the suffering they create. In the end, history's most inbred man left behind not a strengthened bloodline, but a shattered empire, and a permanent reminder that true nobility lies not in genetic purity, but in the courage to value human dignity above all other considerations. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.